our son's lavish housewarming party, my wife grabbed my hand and whispered, "We need to leave now." I asked, "Why?" She stayed silent until we got in the car. Finally, she turned to me and said, "You didn't actually see it, did you?" What she said next left me frozen. I have replayed that party more times than I can count. The way you replay the last ordinary hour before a diagnosis, looking for the moment it turned. There is no such moment. That is the part nobody tells you. The turn had happened 2 years earlier, on an afternoon in October, and everything since had only been the long, patient arrival of it. The house sat at the top of a cul-de-sac in the kind of neighborhood where the landscaping trucks outnumber the mail trucks. 4 bedrooms, a stone patio, string lights crossing overhead in neat rows, the way they do in magazines. There was a hired bartender in a black vest muddling fruit into glasses, and 40 guests I mostly did not know holding small plates, and my son standing in the middle of all of it with his shirt open 1 button too many, and that big easy laugh he has had since he was a boy. I ran a hardware store for 34 years. I know what plywood costs, what a stone patio costs, what 40 guests and a bartender cost. I spent the first hour of that party doing math I did not want to do, and the second hour making myself stop. He gave us the tour himself. A 6-burner range, a wine refrigerator with its own little theater lighting, a kitchen island topped in marble the color of weather moving in. I laid my hand flat on that island and said it was really something, and I meant it, and underneath meaning it, I was thinking that a man who manages a phone store does not buy this island. My wife was quieter than usual. I noticed it the way you notice a draft without stopping to find the window. She spent a long stretch of the evening on a stool across that island from our daughter-in-law, nodding, laughing in the right places, and I remember feeling glad the two of them were finally warming up to each other. Then, a little before 9, she crossed the patio and took my wrist. Not a touch, a grip. The kind you use when a car is running a red light and somebody you love is standing in the crosswalk. She told me we had to go, and when I asked her why, something in her face came down like a shock gate, and she said nothing at all. She said nothing while we found our coats. She said nothing while our son hugged her at the door and told her to take home some cake. She said nothing for 3 blocks, and I drove those 3 blocks with my heart going like a bird against a window, because in 40 years of marriage, I had never once seen that particular face. She waited until we were 3 blocks away, past the last of the parked cars, before she answered me. "The ring," she said. "His wife is wearing your mother's ring." I laughed. I want to be honest about that. My first response to the worst sentence of my life was a short, stupid laugh, because the thing she was saying was impossible. My mother's ring was a square-cut emerald in a plain yellow gold band, no side stones, no engraving, and it had been gone for 2 years. Gone the way things are gone when a window gets smashed while you are standing at a graveside across town. "You saw an emerald," I told her. "There are 10,000 square emeralds in the world." My wife looked at me the way she does when she is done being doubted, which is a look I have received maybe 5 times in 40 years and been wrong about all 5. "Not like this one," she said. "This one has the chip. My father bought that ring in 1961 with 2 months of overtime from the mill, back before he had the store, and my mother wore it for 50 years, through a bankruptcy, through a bad hip, through 2 winters when the furnace ran on prayer. She caught it on a car door outside a church in 1979 and knocked a flake off the northeast corner of the stone, and she told that story at every holiday table for the rest of her life, holding her hand up to the light so you could see where the flaw caught it. She never had it repaired. She said the chip was the only proof the ring had lived with her instead of in a drawer. When she passed, it came to us in a small box with cotton inside, and my wife wore it on a chain some days and kept it in the safe the rest, because it was too small for her finger and too large for her heart, and neither of us ever got around to resizing it. I sat across that island from her for an hour," my wife said. "We talked about backsplash tile, herringbone versus straight lay. I nodded at everything she said, and I watched her twist that ring the whole time, and every third turn the chip came around and caught the light like a signal mirror. I would know that ring in my sleep. I would know it in the dark. We were in our own driveway by then. I shut the engine off, and neither of us moved to go inside. The porch light was on, the new porch light, on the new wiring, beside the door with the locks our son had installed with his own 2 hands, and I sat there in the dark, listening to the engine tick and cool, trying to build any version of the world where what she was telling me could be an accident. The break-in happened on a Thursday in October 2 years ago while we were burying my wife's brother. He had been sick a long time, and the funeral was small, out at the cemetery on the county road, and we stood in a wind that kept lifting the canvas of the tent and drove home tired in the particular way grief makes you tired, from the inside out. I saw the kitchen window from the driveway, a hole in the glass the size of a dinner plate and cracks running out of it like a map of rivers, and the storm door not quite shut, and I knew before I was out of the car. Whoever it was had walked past the television, past my wife's good purse sitting right there on the counter with $140 in it, past the silver in the dining room hutch. They went down the hall, into our bedroom, into the closet, straight to the safe as if the house had handed them a map. The safe stood open. Not pried. Open. They took 3 things. My mother's ring in its small box, my father's coin collection, 41 silver dollars he had started saving in 1948, each one in a paper sleeve with the year written in his blocky carpenter's pencil, and $38,000 in banded cash, which I know is a foolish thing to keep in a house, and which we kept anyway because it was the Lake Cottage money. My wife had a folder of listings in the kitchen drawer. There was one place with a green dock we had walked out on twice, in our shoes, like trespassers, and stood at the end of it not talking. We were maybe a year away. The money had a purpose so specific we could see it from the end of that dock, and that is why it was in the safe instead of the bank, because it did not feel like money anymore. It felt like the thing itself. The alarm never went off. The responding officer was young and careful, and he wrote that down twice, once when I said it, and once when he checked the panel himself. Then he asked who had the code. Us, I said. The alarm company. And our son. He waters the plants when we travel. The officer wrote that down too, and I remember being annoyed that he did. Annoyed at the implication sitting in his neat handwriting, and saying something sharp about how the boy had a key because he was our boy. Later, after the fingerprint man had come and gone, I swept up the glass myself. I have sold window glass for 3 decades, and I have boarded up after storms and burglaries and one memorable raccoon, and I noticed, sweeping, that most of the glass was outside, in the flower bed, glittering in the mums. Broken glass falls the way it is pushed. I stood there with the dustpan and had a thought, and the thought knocked once, and I did not let it in. I decided the frame had kicked it out somehow. You can talk yourself out of nearly anything the week you have been robbed. It is a skill like any other, and I was good at it. Our son was at the house within the hour. He came in work boots with plywood already in the bed of his truck, and he had the kitchen window boarded before full dark. I stood in the yard and held the light for him, which was a courtesy on his part because he did not need it. The boards fit on the first try. I remember noticing that, the way you notice good work anywhere. The sheet meeting the frame square and true with no trimming, and I remember thinking, that is my boy. A hardware man's son. Measures once because he already knows. Then he changed the locks. Both doors, front and back, new deadbolts still in their boxes, and he did it fast and clean because I taught him to do it fast and clean. He grew up in the store. Summers stocking shelves, cutting keys at 14, pinning cylinders at the workbench with safety glasses too big for his face, while my customers watched over his shoulder like it was television. People used to ask for him. There is a kind of pride specific to watching your child be trusted by strangers, and I had years of it, and I thought about those years while he knelt at my front door with a screwdriver, making my house safe from the world. My wife could not stop shaking, not crying so much as leaking, wiping her face with the back of her wrist and apologizing for it, which broke my heart worse than sobbing would have. Our son sat with her on the porch steps for a long time, with his arm around her shoulders, her head against him, and he kept saying the same 2 things in the same low voice. Whoever it was, they are gone now. You are safe. He said it the way you gentle a spooked animal, patient, over and over, until her breathing came back down, and I stood in the doorway of my violated house and thanked God for him. I did. I used those words silently, watching the 2 of them under the porch light. He stayed the night on the couch. Around midnight, he and I sat up over coffee at the kitchen table, both of us too wired to sleep, and we went through it the way men go through a thing, sideways, practically. He asked what the police had said. He asked about the alarm and shook his head at it and said those panels fail more than people think. And then he asked, stirring his coffee, whether we had photographs of the coins. For the claim, he said, they will want them itemized, year, condition, everything. Insurance people will use any gap you leave them. I told him his grandfather had photographed every one of them in 1994 on the pool table, and that the pictures were in the fireproof box with the appraisal, and he nodded and said, good, that is good, and we sat there a while longer with our coffee going cold. When I went up to bed, I looked back at him once, stretched out on the couch in the half-dark with his boots by the door, our guard against the night, and I felt about as lucky as a robbed man can feel. The claim took 4 months, which the adjuster assured us was fast. He was a decent enough fellow with a clipboard and a laser measurer, and he walked the house making small sounds of sympathy, while he photographed the boarded window from 6 angles. The ring had been appraised at $9,400 in 2011, and my father's coins came in at a little over $11,000 on the strength of his photographs and the dealer appraisal in the fireproof box, and in the end the company paid on both, minus the deductible, after a season of forms that asked the same questions in different orders. The cash was simply gone. Homeowner policies cover a couple $100s of currency, the adjuster explained, apologetic, hands open, as if he were telling me about weather. $38,000, and the policy shrugged. I did not argue. There was nobody to argue with. The Lake Cottage money had been real enough to stand on, and then it was a paragraph in a denial letter, and my wife took the folder of listings out of the kitchen drawer that week and moved it to the bottom drawer of the desk in the spare room, which is where Hope goes in our house when it needs to rest. She stopped wearing her own jewelry for a while, not deciding to, just drifting out of the habit, her earrings staying in the dish by the sink, and when I asked her about it once, she looked down at her bare hands like they belonged to a neighbor and said she did not feel like calling attention to anything. The empty ring box stayed in her dresser, small, hinged, the cotton inside still holding a faint dent the shape of a band. I know because I looked more than once the way your tongue goes to a missing tooth. For a month or so, the new locks felt wrong in my hand. Stiffer, the key seating a hair differently, the bolt throwing with a newer, harder sound. Every evening I locked up, and every evening the sound said, this is because of what happened. Then, the way everything does, it stopped saying anything at all. The window glass got replaced. The mums came back on their own the next fall, wildly, as if fertilized by the whole affair. And we relearned our own house the way you relearn a word you once misspelled in public. Carefully, then automatically, then completely as though it had never happened. The police report stayed open in the technical sense that a drawer stays open when nobody pushes it shut. The young officer called twice in the first month, then a detective called once to say pawn shops and secondhand dealers were being monitored, and then nobody called at all. 2 years is long enough to bury almost anything, if everyone around you is willing to keep shoveling. I want that understood, in fairness to us. We were not fools. We were just a family, and a family is a machine built specifically not to see certain things. Life went on, and our son's life went on a little faster than ours. The truck came first, maybe a year after the break-in. Newer, bigger, a chrome package that caught the sun from 2 blocks away. He said the dealership had made him a deal on the trade. End of quarter, they practically begged him, and I nodded along long because that is a sentence men say to each other, and there is no polite way to weigh it. Then came the wedding, which was small and honestly lovely. A courthouse ceremony and a dinner afterward at a place with cloth napkins, 20 of us. And the girl wore a modest little solitaire that he told me privately he was going to upgrade someday when things opened up. I clapped him on the shoulder and told him her hand did not know the difference and her heart never would. I remember exactly where we were standing when I said that. We saw them at holidays and restaurants mostly. Their apartment was small, the parking was impossible, the building did not allow much. There were always reasons, none of them suspicious, and all of them, I see now, load-bearing. My wife would say afterward that the girl was pleasant in the way of a hotel lobby, agreeable and impersonal, and I would tell her to give it time. Families take years to knit. I believed that. I still believe that, which is its own kind of injury. Then, last spring, they took us to a steakhouse and announced they had bought a house. Not were buying. Had bought. Closed the previous Friday. Our son slid his phone across the table with the listing photos on it, the stone patio, the island, the yard, and I looked at the price at the bottom of the screen before I could stop myself. The way you look at a wreck on the highway. I asked him gently over the bread how they had managed it. I kept my voice in the range reserved for asking about gas mileage, and he smiled, easy as ever, and said, "We got creative with the down payment." His wife squeezed his arm and laughed, and the conversation moved on to school districts for someday. And I sat there doing arithmetic against my will. He managed a phone store in the mall. She did social media for a chain of dental clinics, posting before and after pictures of strangers' teeth. I knew roughly what those jobs paid, the way a man who has signed 34 years of payroll checks knows what everything pays, and none of it reached the bottom of that listing photo. Not close, not creative. I let it go. I want to be honest about why. It was not stupidity, and it was not blindness. It was that my own father assumed the worst of me at that age. Every loan, every plan, every girl. And I had stood at his graveside still angry about it, and I had sworn a specific oath to myself about the kind of father I would be instead. You want to believe your kids are doing well. You are built to believe it, the way a hinge is built to swing. The housewarming invitation came in the mail 6 weeks later, printed on cardstock heavy enough to shim a door. We sat at our kitchen table until 2 in the morning, 2 mugs of tea going cold between us, and she walked me through the party a second time. The same party I had just attended. It was like being shown the same photograph under a different light and finding a figure standing in the trees. She had seen the hand first, she said, early, when our daughter-in-law reached across the island for the cake knife. Greenstone, gold band, and something old about the cut, and her whole body had gone quiet the way a house goes quiet before weather. But she is my wife, which means she does not act on the first ring of any bell. She got herself onto a stool across the island and settled in, and for the next hour she talked backsplash tile, herringbone versus straight lay, grout in warm gray versus bright white. She nodded and laughed and asked follow-up questions, and the whole time she watched that hand the way a cat watches a gap under a fence. The girl twists it, she told me. When she talks, she twists it with her thumb, around and around, and every third turn the chip comes up over the top of the stone and catches the light, the northeast corner. I have watched your mother hold that law up to 50 holiday dinners. I sat there smiling about grout, and I counted it around 11 times, and then I did not need to count anymore. I asked her why she had not told me right then, in the house, and she gave me the look she saves for questions I already know the answer to. Because you have a face like a weather report, she said. Anyone in that kitchen could have read you inside a minute, and I did not know yet what we were standing in, and you do not stomp around in a thing before you know how deep it goes. So instead, she said, she did something useful. Before we left, she asked our daughter-in-law for a picture. Just the 2 of us girls, she said, come here. And the girl was delighted. They stood at the end of the island, cheeks together, and my wife stacked their hands on the marble, hers underneath, the girl's on top, and said something about how young hands photograph better. The girl laughed and angled her fingers toward the light. She was proud of it. Whatever else is true, she wanted that stone in the picture. My wife slid her phone across the table to me, and I put on my reading glasses and spread the image wide with 2 fingers, wider until the stone filled the screen, grainy and green. And there it was, the northeast corner, a little bite of absence, the exact shape I had been seeing across dinner tables my entire life, sitting on the hand of a woman married into my family 14 months ago. I asked her the only question left. Why a picture? Why not just tell me in the car and be done? Because tomorrow, she said, we are going to have to prove what we saw to people who do not love us, and pictures do not get emotional. I did not sleep. I built theories instead, lying on my back in the dark, and watched each one die of natural causes. Estate sale, I thought. She loves old things, the girl. Maybe she found it at an estate sale. Some dealer bought it off some fence years ago, and it worked its way back to a folding table in a stranger's garage, 40 miles from where it started. That one lived the longest, almost an hour. Then I did the honest math on a stone with a documented chip on its northeast corner landing, out of all the hands in the world, on the hand of the woman married to the man who had the alarm code, and the theory died the way the big ones do, quietly, of embarrassment. Reproduction, I thought next. Jewelers copy heirloom rings all the time, except nobody copies a flaw. A flaw is the one thing money always fixes. Coincidence, I thought. 10,000 square emeralds, and heard my wife's voice saying the chip, and that was that. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, with the theories all dead around me, an older memory got up and walked into the room. Glass in the flower bed, glittering in the mums outside the window 2 Octobers ago, and me standing over it with a dustpan explaining it away to the only witness who mattered. Broken glass falls the way it is pushed. I had known that for 30 years before that afternoon, and I have known it every day since. And for 1 week in the middle, I had chosen not to know it, because the alternative sat at my kitchen table drinking my coffee and asking thoughtful questions about the claim. I sat up. My wife was awake too. As we lay there in the dark with the clock ticking like something being decided, and finally she said, "Tell me where you are," and I told her about the glass, saying it out loud for the first time in 2 years, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "All right, now we know we are not inventing this out of one photograph." In the morning, over eggs neither of us ate, we had the only argument of the whole affair, if you can call it that. I wanted to call him. That was my whole plan, the entire architecture of it. Call my son, ask him to come over, put the photograph on the table between us, and watch his face, because I had read that face for 32 years, and I believed, God help me, that I would know. My wife put her hand flat on the table, the way she does when a thing needs to stop moving. "If we are wrong," she said, "we will have accused him of nothing, because we will never have accused him at all. And if we are right, we will have done exactly one thing. We will have warned him." I looked at her for a long time, 40 years, and I am still learning which one of us is the load-bearing wall. We took the photograph to the police instead. The detective who had worked our case was still there, 3 desks back, in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and toner. He is close to retirement, the kind of man who says little and forgets less, built like a filing cabinet and about as excitable. He remembered us before we finished introducing ourselves, which I found out later is not a compliment so much as a symptom. "Cases like ours," he said, "the ones with a wrong-shaped detail in them, do not file themselves away properly. They sit out on the desk of the mind." We showed him the photograph. He looked at it for a long time without touching the phone, the way you look at a fish deciding whether it is worth a cleaning. Then he asked my wife to send it to an address he wrote on the back of a business card, and he went and pulled the physical file, an actual folder in an actual box. And I watched him page through his own 2-year-old handwriting until he found what he was looking for and set the folder down open, facing us, his finger on a line. Who had the code? Homeowners, alarm comer's son, key, waters plants. He had written it the day after the young officer had, separately in his own hand. 2 men I had been annoyed at in stereo for doing their jobs. He asked good, boring questions for 40 minutes. The claim number, whether we still had the appraisal with the stone described, whether the ring had a chip, and whether that chip appeared in the appraisal, and when I said yes, both. He made a small note, and I watched something in his posture settle, like a truck shifting into the gear it will climb the whole hill in. He explained in the flat voice men like him use for the sharpest things that the state had required secondhand dealers and pawn shops to upload their transactions to a database for years now. Item descriptions, seller identification, dates. If the stone had ever crossed a counter in this state, he said, it left a footprint, and footprints do not get nervous, and they do not hire lawyers. Then he asked a question I have thought about every day since. Who has keys to your house right now, today? I opened my mouth to answer and heard the answer before I said it. Our son changed the locks the night of the break-in. Our son bought the deadbolts. Our son pinned the cylinders and cut the keys and handed 2 of them to me in my own kitchen, and kept the 3rd on his ring for the plants, for emergencies, for 2 years, and I had slept 10 feet from my own back door every night of it. The detective watched me arrive at all of this without saying a word, and then he nodded, once, the way you nod at a man who has finally read the sign he has been standing under. At the door, he asked one last thing. Does your son know you came in today? No, we said. Good, he said, and he kept the photo. Then came the waiting, which nobody warns you about. Television skips this part. In television, the detective calls back before the commercial. In life, there were 3 days where nothing happened except our entire lives continuing to occur. Meals and mail and a dentist appointment my wife kept out of pure stubbornness. All of it conducted on top of a trap door. Our son called the second evening. I watched his name light up the phone on the counter and let it ring twice while my wife and I looked at each other over it like the thing might go off. Then I answered because not answering was its own kind of message. He was cheerful. He was completely, unremarkably himself. He said we had left before the cake and that his wife had saved us a corner piece with the frosting flour on it and that he wanted to drop it by. And then he said the sentence that nearly finished me. He said also, the guest bathroom toilet keeps running, and I know it is something with the flapper, but you can diagnose that stuff by ear. So when you come by, bring your good patience. Bring your good patience. A thing I used to say to him at the store when a customer came in holding a broken thing and a theory. He had kept it all these years, the way sons keep their father's sentences, and he handed it back to me across a phone line while I stood in my kitchen knowing what I knew, and I heard myself laugh and say, sure, this weekend maybe, and ask after his wife and tell him to thaw the cake corner first. I performed my entire self for my own child, and he did not notice, and I did not know which of those 2 facts was worse. My wife took the phone from me after and set it face down. You did fine, she said. I told her I felt like a traitor. She thought about that longer than I wanted her to, and then she said, one of the people on that phone call was betraying the other one, and it started 2 years before tonight. The 3rd day, I drove past the pawn shop. The detective had mentioned the name of the plaza without meaning anything by it, and it turned out to be on the way to the lumberyard if you take the long way, and I took the long way. I did not stop. I drove past at the speed limit exactly, like a man with an alibi, and looked once, guitars in the window, gold chains on a velvet board, a neon sign promising the most for your gold. Somewhere behind that glass was a counter and a ledger, and I kept driving, because the detective had said let the record do the walking, and because I was afraid, if I stood where it had happened, that I would be able to see it. That night, I checked the locks twice. My own locks now, pinned at my own bench. It did not help the way I thought it would. That same night, a little after midnight, I rekeyed my own house. I had been lying in the dark doing the arithmetic of it. The 3rd key riding around town on my son's key ring, and at some point the arithmetic stood me up and walked me down to the work workbench in the garage. I have a pin kit older than my marriage. Followers, tweezers, a little plastic organizer with springs and drivers sorted by size. The whole kit worn smooth at the corners from 3 decades of other people's emergencies. I pulled the cylinder from the back door first and set it in the vise, and my hands did the whole thing on their own, the way hands will when you have done a task 10,000 times and the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. Where the rest of me was the store. 20 years gone. A boy of 14 on a stool at my elbow with safety glasses too big for his face, tongue in the corner of his mouth, pinning his first cylinder while I watched and did not help. He dropped the springs twice. The third time it went together smooth as water, and he looked up at me with the whole rest of his life in his face. And one of my regulars standing at the register said, "Well, there goes your job." And everybody laughed, me loudest. I taught him that locks are a promise you make to a stranger. I remember saying it exactly that way because I had rehearsed it, the way fathers rehearse the sentences they hope will outlive them. A lock says, "Whoever you are, this line is real." I taught him that with my own mouth at my own bench, and somewhere between that stool and this midnight, he had decided the promise ran in one direction only. Rekeying a lock is not dramatic. It is springs and brass and a drop of oil, 10 minutes a door if your hands are steady, and my hands were steady, which felt obscene. I kept waiting for them to shake. They never did. Everything in me that was falling down had the decency to fall down somewhere behind the eyes and leave the hands alone, and I finished the back door and moved to the front, working in the cone of light like a surgeon in a theater of one. My wife appeared in the doorway to the kitchen in her robe. She did not ask what I was doing because it was obvious, and she did not tell me it could wait until morning because we both knew it could, and that was not the point. She went away and came back with the good desk lamp from the spare room and plugged it in next to me without a word, doubling my light, and then she sat on the step in her robe and kept me company while I changed the promise of our house. In the morning, there were 2 new keys on the hook by the door. There used to be 3. The detective called on the 4th day in the middle of the afternoon, and for about 90 seconds, I got my whole life handed back to me. The ring had surfaced in the database, he said. A pawn shop 40 minutes south of us. In a plaza I now knew the look of at exactly the speed limit. The transaction was a purchase, over the counter, all of it legal and documented and daylight. 8 months after the break-in, a woman had walked in, tried the ring on, and bought it outright. Identification on file, as required. The identification belonged to our daughter-in-law. And here's the thing I am least proud of in this entire account. I felt relief. It arrived in my chest like warm water, instant and total, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear building an entire cathedral out of it in real time. She bought it. She bought it at a shop, over a counter, with her own name, like an honest person, which meant our son had never touched it, which meant some actual burglar, some stranger with a crowbar, had fenced my mother's ring 2 counties over, and it had sat in a glass case under a neon sign until, of all the hands in all the world, the girl who married into our family had wandered in and been caught by a greenstone the way anyone might. A coincidence, yes, an enormous one. But coincidence is just a word for the mathematics we happen to witness. And people win lotteries every single week, and somebody has to. And my boy asked me to come fix his toilet, and my boy saved us the corner piece of cake with the frosting flour. I actually said some of this out loud. I could hear my own voice doing it, climbing, hopeful. A man assembling a ladder while he falls. My wife did not sit down. That is the detail I keep. The whole call, she stood by the counter with her arms folded, watching me, and when I put my hand over the phone and gave her the good news, her face did not move at all. She said quietly, "Ask him who sold it to the shop in the first place." And the line went so still I thought the call had dropped, because of course, the database does not begin with the purchase. A shop cannot sell a ring it never bought. Somewhere upstream of the girl at the counter, there was another line in another ledger, an intake, a seller, a name and a signature and a date. And the detective had been sitting on the other end of that phone letting me finish my cathedral before he said anything at all, which I understand now was a kindness, or a technique, or both. I pulled the rest of that shop's records, he said, finally. "You and your wife should come in. Tomorrow morning is better than the afternoon." I asked him if he could just tell me now. "No," he said, "not this." And that was the whole answer. And it told me everything, and let me keep nothing. That night was the worst one, and I include in the comparison every night that came after, because that night still had 2 doors in it. Whatever waited in the detective's folder was fixed, printed, already true, but I did not know it yet, and so I spent the dark hours running back and forth between the 2 doors like a man in a burning hallway, trying both handles over and over as if one of them might have changed its mind. The memories came on their own schedule, and each one arrived twice, once the way I had kept it, and once the way it actually was, the plywood bit on the first try. I had kept that one polished on the shelf for 2 years, my boy, a hardware man's son, measures once. Now it came back around and stood in the doorway with its coat still on. The boards fit the first try because the boards were cut before he came. You do not cut plywood square to a broken window by eye in your own driveway across town. You cut it to a window you have already measured, a window you know like your own bedroom window, because it was your own kitchen window for 18 years. He asked if we had photographs of the coins. For the claim, he said, they will want them itemized. I had kept that one as evidence of how sharp he was, how he thought of the things I would forget. It came back around as a different animal entirely. A man moving stolen coins wants to know exactly one thing, which is whether anybody, anywhere, can prove what those coins look like. He asked me across my own kitchen table, stirring coffee I had made him, and I answered in full, year and condition, and the appraisal in the fireproof box, and he said, "Good, that is good," and the glass in the mums, which I have already confessed to twice and will not perform again. But here is the one that did the real cutting, and it was not evidence of anything. He was 8 years old, and I used to let him count the till at closing, and he would stand on the milk crate behind the register, dead serious, licking his thumb like a 70-year-old bank teller, stacking the fives and telling me the total, and he was never wrong, and I would say, "To the penny, partner," and he would look up like I had knighted him. I lay in the dark holding that one, because whatever was in the folder, that boy on the milk crate had also happened. Both things were going to have to live in the same man, and I did not see how, and I still mostly do not. Sometime before dawn, my wife spoke into the ceiling. I thought she was asleep. "Whatever is in that room tomorrow," she said, "is already true tonight. We just have not been introduced. So grieve now if you can get a head start on it, because tomorrow I need you upright." We got up in the dark. We made coffee neither of us drank, and we drove downtown with the heater ticking. 2 people going to be introduced. The room was small and gray, and the table was bolted to the floor, which I noticed the way you notice things when you are trying not to notice the folder. The detective sat across from us and did not make a speech. I will always be grateful for that. He opened the folder, took out a single photocopy, turned it around with 2 fingers, and slid it across the table. And then he sat back and let paper do the talking. It was a pawn slip, an intake, from that same shop, dated long before the girl ever tried anything on. The item line was typed in the shop's dull commercial shorthand, and I read it twice. 1 square-cut emerald ring, yellow gold band, chipped to upper corner of stone. There it was. My mother's whole story, the church door in 1979 and 50 holiday dinners of held-up light, reduced to 8 words of damage description in a stranger's inventory system. And the strangest thing is that this is the line that made it real, more than anything that came after. Somebody who had never loved anybody in my family had looked at that stone under a loupe and written down the flaw as a defect. Then my eyes went where the detective knew they would go, down the form, to the seller line, to the signature. I had watched that signature form on homework pages at our kitchen table. I had watched it practice itself in the margins of order pads at the store, looping and preening, a boy deciding who he was going to be one letter at a time. My son pawned my mother's ring 19 days after the break-in. The coin collection was on the same slip. 41 silver dollars, itemized, years listed in a neat column, the shop's typist faithfully transcribing my father's life stations at a bulk rate. Same counter, same afternoon, same signature. The detective let me sit with that for a moment, and then he laid down the second sheet, which was a timeline in his own handwriting, dates down the left margin like fence posts. A cash deposit had landed in my son's bank account 11 days after the break-in, $38,000. It sat there, barely touched, for 16 months, cooling, and then it went out in a single wire the week they closed on the house. The down payment, almost to the dollar. The Lake Cottage money bought the stone patio, and the string lights, and the marble island I laid my hand flat on while my heart did arithmetic it refused to show me. The last thing he showed us was from our own file. The original scene photographs, 2 years old. The kitchen window from outside, and the flower bed below it, and the glass in the mums, bright against the mulch, and a note in the margin in the young officer's careful hand. Glass distribution consistent with break from interior. It had been there the whole time, written down the very first day, waiting for the rest of the truth to grow up around it. There was no burglar. There was never a burglar. There was a window broken outward from inside my house by a man who then drove across town with the plywood already cut and boarded up his own hole and changed my locks and sat on my porch with his arm around his shaking mother, telling her over and over in the gentlest voice I ever heard him use that whoever it was, they were gone now, that she was safe. I asked about the girl because some part of me needed a place to put a piece of this. The detective said her purchase was legal and her paperwork was clean. She bought the ring back over the counter 8 months later with her own name, and whether she knew what she was buying back and when she knew it and what got said in that house at night, those were questions for people with subpoenas, he said, and not for fathers. My wife reached over then and turned the pawn slip face down on the table. That is how I know she finished reading before I did. She was already done looking, and I could have stared at that signature until the building closed. The detective laid out what came next in the tone of a man reading a parts list, an affidavit from us, subpoenas for the financial records, already drafted, waiting on a signature that was not ours, a warrant inside the week probably, staged burglary, insurance fraud, grand theft, and he named the statute numbers the way I used to name pipe fittings, without cruelty, without interest, just the sizes of things. Then he set down the second tool. Some families, he said, ask us to steer this toward restitution instead. Pay it back quietly, no charges. It happens more than you would think. He said it with no weight at all, both hands flat on the table, a man showing you the 2 items and letting you price them yourself. I looked at my wife, 40 years, and I knew the shape of her silence before she filled it. He sat with his arm around me on that porch, she said, and told me I was safe. She was not talking to the detective. She was not really talking to me. He picked a lie that needed my shaking to work, she said, and he practiced it until it was gentle. You do not pay that back. There is no account it comes out of. Press it. I signed the affidavit with the pen from my shirt pocket, which has been the same kind of pen for 34 years. The ones I bought by the gross for the counter at the store, the ones half this town has signed a receipt with. It wrote the same as it always writes. We drove home the long way, past the lumberyard, not talking. That evening, his name lit up my wife's phone with a photograph. The stone patio at sunset, string lights burning against a pink sky, and under it the message, come by Sunday. We barely got to visit at the party. Neither of us touched the phone. It stayed on the counter between us while we ate, lit up, then dimmed, then went dark on its own the way they do. They arrested him on a Tuesday morning. The detective had told us the day, not as an invitation, just so we would not hear it first from a neighbor, and we drove over anyway without ever deciding to, the way you drive to a hospital. We parked down the street behind a landscaping trailer. 2 people in a sedan with coffee going cold in the cup holders, watching the top of the cul-de-sac. They came at 20 to 8. 2 unmarked cars and 1 cruiser. No lights, no hurry. He answered the door in the gray t-shirt he sleeps in, and even from down the block I could read the whole conversation in his shoulders. The easy confidence going in, the stillness, and then the slow rotation of a man putting his hands behind his back on the front steps of a house my mother's ring had paid for. The neighbors watered their lawns with tremendous concentration. Staged burglary, insurance fraud, grand theft. The words had sounded like pipe fittings in the gray room. In the morning light on that street, they sounded like what they were. His wife came out to the porch in a robe, and an officer held open a small paper evidence bag, and I watched her work the ring off her finger. It took a moment. She had to twist it one last time, thumb and forefinger, around, and then it dropped into the bag, and a green flash went through the plastic as it caught the early sun. And that was the last time anyone in my family will ever see it outside a courtroom. From the back seat of the cruiser, my son looked down the street and found our car. I do not know how he knew to look. He held the look for a long moment through 2 panes of glass and 40 yards of mourning, and I did not look away because I decided he should not get to be the one who watched me do that. The detective called that afternoon to say it had gone clean, and at the end, almost as an afterthought, he told me where the photograph ended up, the one my wife asked for with a smile at the party. 2 women, cheek to cheek, hands stacked on the marble, my mother's emerald catching the string lights. It is page 1 of the case file now. They staple it inside the front cover, he said. It is the first thing anyone sees when they open him up.